Alright, so we have our learning goals from the last video. In this one, we're going to recap a bit before we jump into planning our milestones and really creating that roadmap for our course. But before we get started, I want to start with a quick recap. So we know where we want our students to be at the end of the learning cycle, and we also have a better idea of the goals that will help students achieve this vision. We also know that we have a fixed amount of time to guide students from point A to point B. Now it is time to use this information to begin sketching the roadmap, or that basic design for our chosen learning cycle. In this activity, I want you to start by figuring out how much time you would need to spend on each goal or learning outcome you created. And then I want you to think about where these goals would fall throughout the learning cycle. Finally, I want you to begin to mark where in the learning cycle you plan to check in on student progress. These would be your formal and informal assessments, your rough drafts, critiques, one-on-ones, check-ins, papers, you name it. The key here is to make sure each assessment we plan guides students towards full comprehension, that ability to apply our course goals in academic and non-academic settings. Alright, so I'm calling a really quick time out here because assessments are actually a key component of backwards design. When you sift through the literature on backwards design, this concept of authentic assessments pops up pretty frequently. But what does this actually mean? Well, according to this design framework, authentic assessments are realistically contextualized, meaning the task itself simulates the way in which a person's abilities are tested in real-world scenarios. They also require judgment and innovation, so students are given a complex problem to solve that requires them to apply what they've learned to these unique, multi-dimensional situations. They also allow opportunities for students to rehearse, practice, consult resources, and get feedback on their work so they can refine that end product. Now remember, I want you to try to keep your planning high level at this stage. This is really just meant to be a roadmap, a sketch of your course. We'll start to get into more detailed planning in the next activity. Now, if you're feeling confident and ready to get started, stop this video and get to work. You'll find an example of my fleshed out roadmap below. If, however, you'd like to see how I built that roadmap and get a better idea of my planning process, well, put back on those lab goggles because we are jumping back into my sample science course. Okay, so typically I like to start with timing. I know that I always dedicate that first full week of class to community building. That means I actually have 14 weeks to guide students towards this full comprehension of my 5 course goals. Because I have such a condensed time frame, I usually start by thinking about how much time students would realistically need to achieve each goal. In this case, conducting a study, consuming research, and making predictions are goals that are pretty time intensive, especially if I want them to feel authentic, to give students this opportunity to approach each concept as scientists would. Now, I actually see these being ongoing, interwoven projects throughout the term, with multiple check-ins and opportunities for feedback and revision. Conducting a study, I'll say, will take about the majority of the course, so maybe 14-ish weeks here, while consuming research and making predictions are closer to about 10 weeks. And this is because I would really want students to feel fairly confident in their ability to perform both of these tasks before jumping into the final throes of their study. Now, my last 2 goals actually build off of one another and are focused on learning basic immunological concepts. And because this is a junior level course, I can see both taking about maybe 4 weeks to fully grasp. Excellent. So now that I have a better idea of how much time I would need to dedicate to each goal, it's time to consider where these goals would fall throughout the learning cycle. So, this is how I'm currently thinking about arranging mine, and I'm not honestly entirely sure about the pacing of these 2 goals, but I'll leave them here for now and revisit when I have a better idea of how the larger goal of conducting a study actually unfolds throughout the term. Be sure to leave yourself some wiggle room here. Now, as you begin to get more granular with your design, you might find the pacing of these goals will need to change to accommodate the different activities and assessments that you have planned. Alright. That brings us to our final step, and that is identifying where in the learning cycle we plan to check in on student progress to make sure they're actually meeting those goals that we've set for them. Now, I usually start this process with the most time-intensive goal in my course, and in this case, that is conducting a study, our 14-week goal. Now, I can envision this maybe having 5 major touch points attached to it. Now, the first one would be this proposal idea and annotated bibliography that I'm thinking would be due around week 3. And I know that there'll probably be some heavy coaching leading up to the submission. Now, the second one that I'd have is an elevator pitch for the proposed study due around week 6, like a 2-minute video shared with the class for feedback, something that gives students a chance to play in the sciences before they really jump into writing. Finally, we have the rough draft due week 11. And I know that I want to kind of have some time between the elevator pitch and the rough draft so that we can have writing workshop, round robin activities, leading up to this final submission. And speaking of our final submission, I have a final draft due week 13. My reasoning for this would give me enough time to review the student work and give feedback before they submit the last part of this project, which is a reflection due in week 15. Now, I actually love ending with a large project reflection. I usually ask students to identify what they did well, what they haven't quite grasped yet, and what steps they plan to take to become better scientists. Now, I like ending with reflection because it makes the project feel a little bit more meaningful. This is a growing body of work, a growing practice, something that I can revisit and work on. When we have a better understanding of our milestones, these major touch points where we're going to check in on progress and where they fall during the learning cycle, we can revisit and tweak our budding roadmap. Now, this is the point to ask yourself. Are there some checkpoints that can be combined into a single assessment? Can some checkpoints be grouped together, better aligned? So, already I am noticing that my original plan for consuming research doesn't quite fit with my timeline for conducting a study. In this case, I would actually prefer students to be pretty confident with sifting through and engaging with academic research before they submit the first draft of their proposal. So that means I would need to begin working towards this goal earlier in the term. Backwards design is an iterative process, and you may find yourself spiraling a bit as you continue to tweak your goals, mark your major milestones, and in the case of our next activity, plan your learning activities. It's important to actually embrace this non-linear iteration. Allow yourself to let your projects evolve, change, tweak over the course of this planning process. Don't forget, we're here to help. If you have any questions along the way, send us an email at online@mcad.edu.